What is up, Starseeds? It's Sid, and today we are going to be talking about bells. Now, I've already done a video on the use of sound frequencies in Narnia, the use of a bell in Narnia, and the use of just like singing and sound frequencies in the Narnian books, The Magician's Nephew in particular. And in that video, I also mentioned, these sound frequency experiments, putting sand on a sound frequency generating table and it creating a sacred geometric shape. Different frequencies create different sacred geometric shapes on these sound frequency generating tables. There are plenty examples of this throughout life. Sound is frequency. Frequency is shape, is color, is all of these things. It's all interconnected. So sounds are so powerful. Also, bells in specific can be very healing. Nowadays, we even associate certain sound frequencies like 528 hertz, 369 hertz with certain things. 528 hertz is the frequency of love. I even have a little necklace that you blow into and it's 528 hertz, or at least it's supposed to be. 432 hertz temple bells are commonly used in meditation to help focus the mind and promote relaxation. There's all these people doing, like sound baths now with the little singing bowls, and some people have lots of different bowls because they have different frequencies and sounds emerging from those different sized bowls. But let's get into the history of bells. The symbolism of the bell is commonly seen during the holiday season, Christmas time, or whatever holiday you celebrate around December. There has been strong ties between religion, especially Christianity, and bells. Bells are played at funerals sometimes, or just in church in general. In the ancient times, bells were considered a musical instrument of the gods. The sound carried the will of the gods, provided peace and happiness. The sound of the bells cleared minds and exiled malevolent spirits. Apparently, bells are often mentioned in the Bible, specifically in the story of Moses. And then the earliest record of bells, like the earliest bell found, was a pottery bell in Neolithic China. The pagans, though, also knew about warding off evil spirits with the use of bells, specifically near the end of the year, like October, November, December time, ringing the bells to get those bad spirits out of there. This also reminds me of in the third Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie, when there's the venom goo, the black kind of Spider-Man, the goo that gets on you and it makes you evil. And so the way that Peter Parker gets rid of the venom goo off of the other camera dude, I forget his name, he put these like metal pipes in a circle around the dude that had the venom goo on him, and then he took another pipe and he rang them all so they would all ring like a bell around him, and the venom goo seeped off of him, and that's how they got him out of it, through sound frequencies. And you could say that the venom goo was an evil spirit, more of a scientific physical version of an evil spirit. Bells were inexpensive back in the day when pagans were really using them, Neolithic China, all of that, and many people could afford to own them. Worldwide palace and temple bells are traditional in Eastern cultures and religions. Bells were rung to announce significant events such as danger, births, deaths, public notices, celebrations, etc. Which makes sense. You want to get a lot of people's attention before you have technology like we have now. How are you going to get all their attention? You're going to make a loud noise. You're going to ring a bell. Obviously, bells are also associated with passage of time and clocks. Bell towers are still used today, including the famous Big Ben in London. Bells can also be rung from towers multiple times a day to signify like it's time to pray, whatever religion that is, or a bell will ring to signify the start of a church service or a religious service. Apparently, in some churches, they also ring bells before they do the bread and the wine thing, the body and the blood of Christ. You guys also might have heard the phrase, every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. So bells have been around for a long time. They can mean a lot of different things. Why is a bell ringing? For many different reasons, most of which are religious or just kind of public service announcements, if you will. I just looked up as well, why are some bells cracked? And the main thing it comes up with is why the Liberty Bell was cracked, because of just kind of casting flaws, extensive use, inherent nature of the materials used. And if I scroll down more, it says, why do church bells have cracks? Iron corrodes with time. if I'm being honest, my own intuition, I do feel like there was a group of people throughout history that has been kind of wiped, where people went around cracking bells. In this video, I'm just going to touch more so on the Nazi authorities in Germany implementing this system to destroy bells in order to make weapons for their war. But now let's get into the destruction of bells. So we know that they have healing frequencies. We know that they are used to notify the public about certain events. They've become normal, especially in churches and these religious spaces, to hear the bells multiple times throughout the service. So they associate it with their everyday life and they associate it with their faith. The Nazis took a great deal of bells and then they even classified them into groups A, B and C, and then group D, as to like which ones they were going to use to make weapons out of first, and then, you know, the ones that were more important they were going to reserve in case they had to use them, they would. But they used group A and then B and C first. They tried to reserve group D that had, you know, historical significance, or they were not deemed as modern. These group D bells were made before 1740, so I guess that was the year that they considered old. They wanted to save those bells if possible. Seems pretty legit, and it seems like they put a significant amount of thought into it for people who were running around destroying bells. So group A, modern bells cast after 1918. These were put on the list to be processed immediately, and this group A was about 70% of all bells in Germany. Then groups B and C, these bells were considered more valuable than those in the group A, but they were still subject to processing as needed. They were about 20% of the total bells. And then group D, this group included the most valuable bells, primarily from the Middle Ages. They were classified as not to be melted down, and they formed, you know, the balance of the remaining bells. So it must have been about 10%. These groupings were also applied, though loosely followed, to bells in occupied countries. Some regions and nations like the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, and Lorraine virtually lost all their bells due to this classifying system. The bells there were considered more modern, not a lot of historical significance, so they took almost all of them. Approximately 175,000 bells were taken, and an estimated 150 were melted down to produce war materials. So this resulted in a loss of sonic traditions and cultural heritage. So these were all taken by Nazi Germany, confiscated, destroyed, and then a lot of them were actually lost, which we'll get into in a second. The Nazi regime confiscated church bells from various European countries, including Germany, Austria, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, and the USSR at the time. They needed certain types of metals for the war effort, and church bells made of bronze or other metals were a readily available source. I don't really think I realized what exactly bells were made out of, but it says here that bells are comprised of bronze, an alloy of roughly 4 parts copper to 1 part tin. And if you guys know anything about copper, that is a very powerful material, okay? Spiritually speaking, copper is extremely healing. Also, sound frequencies are extremely healing. So when you strike a bell, specifically a bell with lots of copper in it, I can imagine the healing effects that it would have. So I can believe the story of needing to destroy bells that were made out of metal in order to make war weapons. However, I don't know if I believe that was all to the story. I have a hunch that there was more to it and that they were destroyed because of their healing frequencies as well. Now, within that number, 150,000 bells that were destroyed, that wasn't just by melting down, it was also by being lost due to bombing and air raids. So the loss of these bells had a profound impact on communities. Like I said, they used them in religious practices as well as just public service announcements. And especially during this time of war, you kind of need that public service announcement. There's no other way people are going to get news that quick from a loud noise of a bell. You know, that means something is up. But they lost that power to ring a bell and people would hear it. They didn't have that anymore. And let's not forget the about 25,000 other bells that were taken as well. So yeah, not all of them were destroyed, but 175,000 bells were taken between 1939 and 1945. Just in that span of 5 or 6 years, all of these bells were confiscated. Now, in case you're wondering if some people tried to put up a fight and not have their bells taken, they did. So some nations pled for their bells to be spared, but it was considered a war crime if they tried to hide their bells, bury them. People tried to do that, but it was considered a war crime that would be punishable. So that made a lot of people afraid to bury bells, but a lot of them did get buried. Some people were willing to take that risk in order to save this thing that gave them so much joy. They would usually allow one bell of insignificant size to remain in a bell tower for that village to ring during an emergency. But when a bell is not very large, how many people are actually going to hear it when it rings? You know what I'm saying? I'm going to leave all of my sources linked in the description of this video, but I also found this other article that says there are historic examples that show authority figures removing bells for both resources for weaponry, like we've been talking about, but as well as a political tool to control the people through enforced silence. That's pretty interesting right there. February 26, 1922, there was a law passed that said all churches had to turn in anything made out of gold, silver, and precious stone. Obviously, you know, the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church was not having that and said that there was no way they could turn in their sacred objects like that. So I wonder how that actually turned out in the details of that specific law. I'm kind of confused as to where this number comes from, but it says that almost 1 million bells in total, from approximately 50,000 to 70,000 churches and monasteries in the state of Russia were seized. Almost 1 million bells were taken. So I get Russia is big, but that is a huge number. We just said that, you know, 175,000 bells were taken. But then over here it says that the Soviets had almost 1 million bells taken, and that 99% of Russian bells were destroyed. During the French Revolution, this is another huge example of the confiscation of bells. The National Assembly passed legislation in November of 1789, placing all church property, including bells, at the disposal of the state of France. And then in August, it became a law that only 2 bells were allowed to be retained by each parish. Every church in France, after August 1792, they could only have 2 bells. But then in July 1793, there was a law passed that said churches were allowed to retain a single bell, with the rest to be delivered within a month for immediate melting down to make cannons. And then on February 21st, 1795, all bell ringing as an outward symbol of religion was prohibited. It was a visible symbol of the Catholic Church dominating the rooftops of French communities, and they just weren't having that. This declared like the demolition of bell towers in France. That's wild. I didn't know that. On May 21st, 1795, the municipality of Paris decreed that all bells be taken to the foundry for conversion into cannons, except for bells that would be needed for non-ritualistic community signaling. So all of those religious bells, that was kind of a religion thing going against the Catholic Church. They were not having that. They wanted all of the bells to be made into cannons, and they really also had beef with, it sounds like, the Catholic Church, the state of France. So during the French Revolution, about 100,000 bells were taken from about 60,000 towers, leaving France with less than 10,000 pre-revolutionary bells remaining. And if you think about the numbers that the Nazis confiscated across multiple different countries in Europe, that was 175,000. This was 100,000 just from France alone. Bells that were too large to be lowered were broken up. And it says here that 8 men worked for 6 weeks to break up the second largest bell that hung in Notre Dame in Paris. And these bells that were used for, signaling public service announcements, they were usually a high pitch that insinuated urgency, while more of these religious ritual bells were the lower pitches. So a very different sound, and all of those lower pitch bells were taken, arguably more of the healing kind of frequencies. During this Nazi time, the bells of France were mostly saved. I was wondering why I didn't see any stats on the bells that were destroyed in France during this time, but I think most of it was because a lot of the bells in France were already destroyed. But also Germany and France had kind of a thing going on where France was like, you really can't take our bells, that really goes against our national heritage. That's like an attack on our country, and we're cool. And Germany was like, okay, yeah, you're right, we're cool, we'll let you be. By the end of the war, not even the German bells were spared. They really tried to use other countries' bells first. Yeah, I think at first they were kind of scrambling trying to use their bells, but once they realized that they needed to raid these other countries for their bells, they were like, well, let's hold off on, turning our bells into ammo. Let's use their bells first. But by the end of the war, the Germans started using their own bells. So during this time, almost 95% of all German bells were removed from their structures, and by the end of the war, the majority of Group A bells had been melted down, leaving Group B and C bells largely untouched in 7 depositories around the country. So across Europe, Germany was the country with both the highest number and highest portion of bells removed during World War II. However, German forces were initially met with internal resistance, both Catholic and Protestant church leaders protesting big time against the removal of their bells. 65,000 of the bells that were confiscated were from Germany and Austria. As for Poland, around 70% of their bells were removed, and of that 70% removed, almost 93% of them were destroyed and melted down. So that's a pretty large portion that was destroyed. However, it says that 70% of them being taken was actually not that high of a percentage of them being taken from the country. But like I said, a lot of those were destroyed, almost all of them. Between 1941 and 1943, about 12,000 bells were taken from Czech towers. About 80% of Czechoslovakian bells were removed, and then they also had the highest proportion of bells destroyed. 95.3% of the bells were destroyed. That's the highest proportion of any country in Europe. It's also important to point out that a lot of these countries lost their bells in World War I, so they really only had 2 decades to try to, make some more bells and get some more new bells back. But then here come the Nazis trying to take them all again. Ooh, a few bells that were cast in 1930s kind of have like a swastika on them or a tribute to Adolf Hitler, and they are still hanging in some bell towers in Germany, causing a rift between churches who can't afford to replace them and concerned citizens. Some 24 of these bells have been discovered and removed in recent years, but there are some still around, like I said, because they don't notice it right away, or they do and they're like, should we replace this? Should we not? It's kind of expensive. Maybe people won't notice. Wow. So after the war, they tried to reunite the bells that were taken that weren't destroyed with their, original homelands. But that process is still continuing. It's an ongoing thing. A lot of bells were buried. A lot of bells were lost. A lot of bells just didn't really have a record of where exactly they were, if they got blew up or not. So of these estimated 25,000 bells that were seized but not destroyed, we really don't know what happened to them. They're just kind of lost in translation. Don't get me wrong, some got returned to where they came from, which is great, but there's still a large number that's missing. If and when bells were returned to their original towns, people absolutely loved that. Obviously, people were overjoyed to have their bells back. It was a huge part of their community. By 1946, the return of the stolen bells from World War II was being widely celebrated. Like I said, today there are still lots of missing bells, but right after the war ended, these countries were like, hey, you got any of our bells left? And they were like, yeah, we do. So the ones that they had readily available that weren't missing, they returned, which I think that is pretty cool. A very different story of the destruction of bells from what my intuition is telling me happened in some areas as well. In Belgium, they celebrated the survival of 727 bells. They had ceremonies organized on October 8th, 1945 and November 5th, 1945. The restitution of the bells helped to bring right to wrongs of the past and was a powerful political tool for the community to counteract some of the extreme oppression since the 1920s, a defiant or a blow to the previous silence of the bells of the previous 75 years caused by the prohibition of bell ringing and the physical destruction of the church. The active restitution of stolen bells is still a present concern. As late as December 2020, Polish bells seized by the Nazis were being restored to their homeland. One bell, which dates back to 1555, originally located in St. Catherine's Church in a town in southern Poland, was tracked down to Munster, Germany, by the Polish church's pastor. Having not been melted down by German forces and being banned from its return to the east by British military authorities, it was instead loaned out to church parishes in former West Germany, where it has been for many decades, in a courtyard of the city's Catholic Church. Once it was sent home to Poland, it was still officially on permanent loan, as it was technically still owned by the German government, which raises some complicated questions on ownership of history and heritage when referring to seized church bells. Obviously, the bells got returned to the Allied countries first, rather than countries that they had some beef with. You guys, sorry for all of the cuts in this video. I just wanted to read these notes off because I'm not great at history. I was really curious as to what online has to say about the destruction of bells, so that is why I wanted to research it and I wanted to film this video. If you guys found this interesting, hooray! If you didn't, then I've got lots of other stuff on my channel that might be more suited for you. Remember that sound frequencies are powerful. Remember that your thoughts are frequencies as well, and your thoughts radiate. Thank you guys so much for watching. Peace out.